Three, two, one. You're listening to Two Babies in a Business, a podcast about business, marketing, growth strategy, staff, clients, babies, marriage. I'm Christina. This is Peter. We're founders and leaders of CIPR Communications. And we're still talking value of tourism, which is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as we're talking about value of tourism right now, it's kind of feeling like maybe the borders could open at some point and tourism could really start to explode. So I think more than ever, the value of tourism conversation is important because as busy as it's going to get, we're probably shifting just in terms of people's focus with respect to what's next year going to look like, and tourism dollars, and governments are going to be really scratching their heads as to where they're going to invest money and how. So really, this is actually a really important conversation today because we're talking about tactics for educating stakeholders. And really stakeholders right now this is a really critical time to be doing a lot of education, right? So certainly stakeholders, let's maybe start off with who are the stakeholders that we're educating. I know we've talked about it a little bit before, but one important stakeholder that obviously my lead-in was sort of talking about is government. And I think, municipal, federal, provincial levels of government are a critical stakeholder when it comes to value of tourism conversations and the role that tourism plays in the economy and the jobs and all of those types of things. What are the other stakeholders, Christina?
You're so funny. I feel like you came in so hot. Here we are, government.
Let's go.
What I will say, just like going back to your first comment, is, we're recording this in June. This is going to kind of go live end of June. So, a lot of our tourism clients right now and destination marketing organizations that we work with are going into this really busy season. And it usually is really busy. But what I will say is it actually usually slows down a bit for them because you've spent your marketing dollars in the spring to advertise your destination for the summer. And, summer becomes about engaging visitors and kind of that whole play. Whereas now, like in the past couple of weeks, we've been helping destination marketing organizations actually kick off their summer marketing extremely late as opposed to previous years, but exciting because, to your point, borders are opening between provinces in Canada for the summer. There's obviously talk about the US border and what's going to happen there in the coming weeks and months. But yeah, I think it's a really exciting time. And I think that a lot of those destination marketing organizations are potentially headed into fall planning. And I think that if you haven't started to consider value of tourism, you need to consider it as a part of fall planning because your summer, even though it will be better than last year, I think that, to your point, you're still going to be lacking in some areas, right? You're not going to have the same record-breaking years as we were seeing prior to COVID. So
totally.
So important. Stakeholders. So typically when we are building that plan, and so, listeners, you've been listening as we built this plan through the past several episodes, but typically we have three main audiences. So your government, which needs a whole, I think, handful of different things.
Mm-hmm.
Your residents, so that kind of more general population feeling. And I think I always caveat that with the informed resident. So not necessarily every Joe Blow, but those that, are the ones, I always qualify these people as the ones that the neighbors ask who they're voting for, right? So that neighbor, that local, that citizen, that's just, a little bit more engaged. Not to like pump our tires, but like I would say that folks like Peter and I, you could say, are the informed, engaged citizen. And then finally, we always throw in media. And I think media is always an important player at this stage in the game because obviously they're going to help you amplify the messages to those other two stakeholder groups.
Yeah. So what are some of the tactics that you like to use when it comes to educating specifically, we're talking about educating stakeholders at this point, because remember, there's educating and then there's empowering campaigns, but this is step one, is educating, and not all destinations need educating per se, but probably most should be starting here. But if you already have sort of been doing some work, then you sort of move on to step two. But so what are some of the educational tactics that you like to deploy?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this is the call to action really comes in the empowerment stage. The
Right.
call to action in your education stage is more read this, look at this, engage with this content.
Mm-hmm.
I usually say, and we've talked polling a few times. We had
Mm-hmm.
Monica from Tourism Kamloops join us and talk polling as well, and the importance there. But actually, polling, I think, becomes a really interesting education piece. So, especially with a telephone poll, we love CIPR loves telephone polls, but you get to go in and there's this really, it's a soft message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about tourism? Do you think it's great? Do you think it contributes to the economy? And you're dialing everyone in an area.
Mm-hmm.
So chances are people are going to go, oh, that was interesting.
Yeah.
Typically, an organization will do some sort of news release afterwards, giving opinions. So, I mean, I love to start there because all of a sudden now you're getting some good real-time data on how much education you have to do. Also, really great data for sharing and educating your politicians in the media. So you're feeding those things. And now you're kind of laying this groundwork of, hey, there's a tourism conversation happening. So I don't think people often think about that as a tactic. I think they think about it as research for your campaign, which 100% it's important. But I also like this whole notion of like using it as a tactic when you start your education.
Well, and you need to have something meaningful to say. You need to have where polling is really valuable in terms of, media will pay attention. If you're putting out a press release about poll results, that's sort of first party data that is new information that adds to the collective conversation about what's going on in the world, right? And so that type of information is just going to get picked up, and it's going to be a story, because it's net new information, if you will. So I agree with you. I think it's probably the most important tactic that you can really deploy, and you can use it in a number of different ways. So you can do your poll and do your press release, and obviously do the media circuit. You can have, and you don't have to share absolutely everything in your poll. You can sort of be a little bit selective in terms of what you share where, but you can have a pitch deck now that you've created for politicians or for even for your tourism stakeholders. So if you have a board of directors, if you have a group of hoteliers, or it depends on how your committees are set up or whatever, but now you have basically something with which to go around to all of your stakeholders with some talking points, and it could also be a way to have a further conversation. So it's like, here's what the data showed, let's now have a conversation about it. So let's get stakeholder groups together to sort of read through the presentation, or go through the information, and then have a discussion about what that means. And that's more valuable. That's another tactic, right? Is the meetings to review and figure out what to do with that information, and is in itself a tactic, and it gets people having a conversation, and it's an educational type tactic.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, where I play devil's advocate there is obviously you should have your plan going into this. So potentially, making sure you're having those meetings is important, but don't let those stakeholders gear you off course unless your answers are so far, like unless the assumptions that you originally made, and we told you not to make assumptions, so we didn't, are so different, then maybe there's a step change. What I'll say about government tactics, because you kind of were dipping into that, is what we do is we try to, and this is harder during COVID, but now that things are opening up, I think there's an opportunity here, is getting one-on-one meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So, your goal is to go and sit down, if you're an executive director of an organization or a tourism manager or whatever it may be, to sit down with that mayor, that councillor. You can do far more with one-on-one meetings and one-on-one conversations or phone calls than you can when you just present to council, right? So your council presentation is important. I think that if you're a GMO, you've probably had some experience doing that. But the one-on-one conversations you get to just be personal, really gear it towards what does this individual know or want to know. And you can, I think, find your allies on a council. So yeah, we typically from education tactics suggest things like, your news release, of course, but like, what's the government letter, and what are you sharing to make that singular politician interested in coming to meet you?
Right.
Then what's the deck, to your point, what's the presentation? And I feel like some people ask me, well, why do you, if we're having a coffee, why do you need a deck? What I always suggest is have a deck, bring it. Like, obviously you're not gonna have a big PowerPoint presentation, but like use it to gear the conversation, because sometimes you are going to go off the rails. And so just to have that, oh, I also wanted to bring up this point, and you flip through your papers, and
you can also give the deck as a follow-up to the meeting as well, in
yeah,
terms of like, here's the deck, so that, for the person you've met with, if they want to dive in a little deeper, do a little, or share with their staff, or share with, if it's a provincial or federal, share with their department or whatever it is, right? So the deck is a nice leave behind. So it's an important piece. It's an important tactic.
totally. I think the update piece too, with your government, so if you've never sent a year in review, like your tourism numbers a year in review, or here's the growth, here's what we like, this is an important time to start establishing some of those things. And again, if you can do it year over year, I think that's important. But even this first stage, so I feel like we built a lot of infographics at this stage, right? Those nice visual, digestible, here's how tourism grew, here's the industries affected, so any of those like quick visuals. And then that becomes, I think, an interesting backgrounder for media, but also becomes something, that you can slice and dice and use as social media content, or in newsletters, or things you can package up for your stakeholders to share too.
Yeah, blogs on your website. So obviously there's the sort of taking that information from the poll and using it in multiple different formats to inform people in various different ways, right?
I'll say
really what it comes to.
Poll and research, right? So if your poll is some of your initial tactics, but through that strategic phase, you were identifying that research that you needed and what else, because there's stuff you're not going to find out from the poll, but you should know, right? So those revenue numbers, your economic numbers, your, industries affected, your jobs, your all of those things. Your tourism champions, like what are those stories? Who are those people? All of those pieces.
Well, and I was going to say, you used the word I was going to use, but really this is really the time at which you're telling the story of tourism in your hometown in various ways to various different stakeholders. And it's really about storytelling, and the best education comes from stories, right? And make it relatable. And how can you relate it to, the individual business, or how can you, relate it to that hotel, or that, that type of thing, right? So I think the more you can make it relatable and story-like, the more memorable you're going to make it, the more impactful you're going to make it. And then obviously, hopefully, as a result of some of this research and polling and some of the other things, it might be a little bit about educating on what the DMO or what your organization is going to do. So, I'll use an example of one poll that I remember we did for a client early days, where, value of tourism was high in the eyes of stakeholders. People valued, the industry, thought it created good jobs, but people didn't really understand or know what the DMO actually did. So, the action item out of that is, more education around the role of the DMO, right? As an example. So, it's sort of like also internally, like, what are you going to do with that information from internal with your staff? What's your game plan? Okay, so we learned this. What does that mean we need to do from an education standpoint? If people don't understand.
I'm into challenging you today, but it's like that conversation, you should not be having your tactic conversation before that conversation, right? So it's like, if you're still in this stage, and it's okay if you're still in that stage, but if you don't have that solid plan and that solid understanding of what needs to be done, and obviously your staff, and some DMOs have larger staff complements than others, need to be on board and need to that piece, you should not be talking tactics yet. I think that understanding kind of the lay of the land and what needs to be said. I think about one client where the real disconnect after kind of the strategy and working through that piece was residents understanding how multifaceted the tourism industry was. And so in that stage, in the strategic stage, we identified, okay, this is an issue and this is a big gap. Joe down the street doesn't realize that his neighbor, who is a carpenter, is actually highly affected by the tourism industry because he does all the carpentry for the hotels in the area. Or, you know, his other neighbor is the blueberry farmer that supplies the, right? Like, I think that is your, like, before you get into the tactics. And I love that you brought this up because you are a visionary of our, like, that's where your mind goes. And I think a lot of like tourism leaders go there first. And so I think make sure you flushed all that out and then start diving into tactics. So this one example, we thought, okay, how are we going to get residents to do this? And it was kind of this like high COVID times where parents were looking online for things to keep their kids busy. So we developed a coloring contest. And so it was literally, you know, it looked like a gingerbread man on a sheet of paper. And it was, you know, draw your tourism champion. And we had examples on the side, like maybe it's a photographer, maybe it's a marketing consultant, maybe it's a hotelier, maybe it's the guy who runs the water slides, obvious things, but also not obvious things. And then parents could submit those back. And then the winner won, you know, a great local experience or prize. But what was interesting about that is, like, as all these things are being shared on social media, you could see residents really trying to get creative on who was attached to the tourism industry.
Thinking outside the box,
yeah, which was identified in that strategic point of residents need to understand that it's not just the guy that works at the hotel that's affected by tourism. And that was really effective. So I think, again, to your point, what stakeholder groups have what gaps? And sometimes you'll know that through conversations, but that research component, and I think probably we miss talking about this, but within those strategic conversations, identifying what is that big gap, and then having your tactics kind of
flow from that.
Flow from there.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
Cool. All right. Well, there's so many tactics.
Yeah.
I feel like the sky's the limit, but if anyone wants to reach out and ask us or run something by, we're both here. I mean, Peter is fantastic at getting creative and thinking about these things. And
Christina obviously does this most of the time and knows the nuts and bolts of how to get it done.
But yeah, we're always welcome to talk. So I'm excited. Next episode, we're going to talk more about those empowerment tactics, which I feel like are the more tangible ones because there's a call to action.
Nice.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. You know where to find us: Spreaker, Spotify, and iTunes, Two Babies in a Business. And on social media, CIPR Comms, just with one M. Leave us a message and engage with our posts. We're interested to hear how you are doing value of tourism.